Bon vespre, benvingudes, benvinguts en nom de la Càtedra de Multilingüisme Linguamón UOC en aquesta conferència del professor Edwards, que estic segur que us interessarà moltes de les coses que us pot presentar. Després en Miquel Strubel farà la presentació del conferenciant. Per part meva, en nom de la càtedra, us volia donar la benvinguda i també recordar-vos una mica que aquestes matèries del multilingüisme relacionades amb l'educació són una de les línies que la càtedra vol potenciar. Heu vist probablement a l'entrada algunes de les publicacions que hem fet darrerament sobre aquests temes. Les motivacions a l'aula de llengües és una publicació, és un llibre de Dornier, de Zoltán Dornier, que creiem que pot fer un gran servei als ensenyants en general i als ensenyants de llengües en concret, i dues novetats molt recents que suposo que seran objecte d'una presentació específica cadascuna. Multilingües des del bressol, que és un llibret, crec que també amb una utilitat potencial molt gran, perquè són moltes les famílies que es troben en una situació en què no sols el matrimoni és de llengües diferents, és a dir, que hi ha dues llengües en l'ambient familiar, sinó que cada dia és més freqüent que les llengües de l'entorn no són cap d'aquestes dues, o almenys n'hi ha una més de diferent. És a dir, que és una qüestió, el fet de poder educar bé els infants en dues o més llengües, una qüestió que interessa moltíssima gent. I l'altre llibre que trobareu aquí sobre a la tauleta que hi ha a l'entrada no tracta ben bé de temes d'educació, però sí de temes d'actualitat, la relació entre la llengua i les reivindicacions nacionals a Catalunya, que és una enquesta que vam fer fa cosa d'un any. En qualsevol cas, intentem, amb activitats com aquestes, prestar un servei a la societat amb un tema que cada vegada ens resulta més present i més exigent, el multilingüisme. No us entretinc més, el tema d'avui és la conferència de John Edwards i ara en farà la presentació el nostre company a la càtedra, el professor Miquel Strubel.
Molt bé, Isidor, moltes gràcies. M'has atrapat posant en silenci el mòbil i per tant no vull allargar gens la presentació perquè és el professor Edwards el que ha d'ocupar el protagonisme d'aquest acte. Jo el que voldria només dir que estem molt contents d'haver emplenat aquesta sala. Hem tingut totes les combinacions possibles, com segurament molts de vosaltres, de gent molt brillant en sales buides, de gent menys brillant en sales plenes, i per tant que s'ompli la sala amb una persona brillant doncs no ens hauria d'estranyar, però en tot cas ens satisfà molt. Un cop dit això, no sabem, perquè no farem una enquesta per esbrinar com heu sabut de la celebració d'aquesta conferència, però sí que tenim nosaltres una base de dades amb adreces electròniques i si algú vol rebre en el futur notificacions ja més personalitzades de les nostres activitats, ens podeu emplenar el full d'inscripció i per només 100 euros, és broma, i així us rebreu notificacions dels actes que organitzem. Bé, avui el professor Edwards ens parlarà d'un tema molt proper al multilingüisme que ens trobem a l'aula. Multilingüisme que ja veureu de seguida de diferents configuracions i combinacions, i ho fa des d'una perspectiva d'un psicòleg que s'ha dedicat des de fa molts anys amb estudis de recerca a banda i banda de l'Atlàntic. Ell va néixer com jo a Anglaterra i ha viscut la major part de la seva vida com jo en un altre país. En el seu cas travessant l'Atlàntic i en el meu cas doncs, travessant el canal de la Mànega, que ja sabeu que de vegades Europa queda allò desconnectat de Gran Bretanya quan hi ha boira. El professor Edwards és psicòleg, tornem-hi, doncs, també vaig estudiar psicologia i ha fet, a banda de la seva tasca d'educador, una sèrie de llibres que van quasi sempre a l'entorn de la relació entre les llengües i la psicologia, i més concretament la psicologia social. I ha dedicat també temps a estudiar diferents casos de llengües minoritàries o minoritzades, que ja sabem que a nosaltres la paraula no ens agrada associar-la amb el cas català, però en la seva exposició ja veurem que hi ha per tots els gustos, perquè la seva experiència és molt vasta, és molt àmplia i per tant, sense més preàmbuls, com diuen, normalment després de parlar 20 minuts, li dono la paraula al professor Edwards. Ready when you are.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and speak a little bit this afternoon about languages in the classroom, language diversity in the classroom, where I think some of the difficult issues arise, and what I think are some of the particular problems and then responses to these problems. And when I was putting together this paper, I came across a very interesting little quotation from two writers who I don't know, so I won't bother telling you their name, but they had this quotation in French, and I assume the translator can French, but I'll read it in French anyway, and some of you I'm sure will understand. L'école est un curieux lieu de langage. Il s'y mélange les langues officielles, privées, scolaires, des langues maternelles, des langues étrangères, de l'argot de lycée, de l'argot de la cité. À considérer toutes ces langues qui cohabitent, je me dis que l'école est peut-être le seul lieu où elles peuvent se retrouver dans leur diversité. Mais il faut être très vigilant et justement tirer parti de cette belle hétérogénéité. That is to say that the school is a particularly interesting arena in which, and the authors would say perhaps one of the very most interesting arenas in which all these different languages come together, and at the end calls for a certain amount of attention, of vigilance, but also in the very final words emphasizes the wonderful heterogeneity. That is to say, the fact of all these languages in the classroom being a fact, first of all, to be recognized, and then more than that, something which could be considered a strength, something which can be built upon, and something which can be celebrated. But of course, the thrust of my talk this afternoon is precisely because, the motivation for it, I should say, is precisely because many people don't think of this heterogeneity as particularly beautiful or appealing. They see this classroom diversity as a problem. One of the things that I've been doing over the years is giving talks to teachers and teachers' organizations, and all my talks have had to do with some point of intersection among education, social class, ethno-linguistic status, group identity. These topics, I think, have always been of great interest to teachers since they're so obviously relevant to the daily life of classrooms, and we could say to the daily life of an ever-increasing number of classrooms. Whether it's a matter of accepting or rejecting non-standard dialects or foreign languages at school, or of adapting classrooms to language diversity, or on the contrary, attempting to maintain some strict or monolingual regime, whether it's a question of seeing the school as a contributor to social change, or alternatively as some supporter of the mainstream status quo, of arguing the benefits or the disadvantages of different forms of bilingual education, that is to say, educational programs that involve the schools making adaptation to children, whether it's a question of embracing multiculturalism or recoiling from it. In all these matters, the knowledge, the sensitivities, the attitudes of teachers are extremely important, which of course is why I thought that that little quotation in French at the beginning was particularly appropriate. And yet, over the time that I've been giving talks to teachers and teachers' organizations, I have been constantly amazed and disappointed. Less amazed, I have to say, as time goes on, but perhaps even more disappointed at how ill-prepared teachers typically are with regard to linguistic and cultural variation in the classroom. The education of teachers generally involves very little exposure to this sort of heterogeneity, and yet, as I implied above, it's easy to see that this heterogeneity is now present in virtually every setting that one can think of around the world. Even in schools in traditional rural areas, let's say, whose populations were, well, once upon a time anyway, both stable and quite local, even these areas are now more and more confronted with children from many different backgrounds. If you consider, just as an example, the geographical spread of Spanish speakers throughout the United States, far beyond the initial areas where they were found in Florida or in the Southwest. That's a case in point. Or, if you like, the widening distribution and permanence of European so-called guest workers, as well as the exploding mobility that's now brought hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans, as well as refugees and other people from around the world to countries in Western Europe and so on. As well as this, many jurisdictions have essentially denied a diversity that was always there, a reflection of a sort of socially imposed ignorance. For example, when I began research work in Nova Scotia, where I live now, a province on the eastern Atlantic coast of Canada, it was immediately clear to me that the prevailing perspectives there made very little room for long-standing groups of low social, economic, and linguistic status. In some schools, for example, there were sizable groups of African-Canadian youngsters, many of them descendants of those who came to Canada during the American Civil War, along what was called, I'm sure some of you will know the term, the Underground Railroad, that brought escaped slaves to freedom in Canada. Others who'd been given land grants in the area in return for service in the British Army. And in other areas, not very far from where I live, there were Acadian children of French-speaking background. An inability or an unwillingness to see such groups as anything other than very minor aberrations in an essentially English stroke Celtic mainstream had the sorts of predictable consequences you can imagine. Children didn't do very well at school, there were early dropout rates, all sorts of problems of that sort, which in a way completed a vicious circle, so that teachers could say, well, obviously those children are not as amenable to instruction, or perhaps they're from groups that don't value education as much as others, and here you see the proof is that they don't stay in school very long, and so on. Well, you see the problem. But I would go further and say, even if there were no great likelihood of teachers encountering social or linguistic diversity in their classrooms at all, increasingly unlikely though that may be, I think you could still make a good case for giving much more attention to diversity in general. Why? Simply because I would say all good education worthy of the name is multicultural. And if this is so, then a logical implication must surely be that any heightening of teachers' cross-cultural and cross-subcultural sensitivities must be a good thing. And I want to point out at the beginning, too, that I think it's important to note that these expanded sensibilities on the part of teachers, and others, of course, but my focus is particularly teachers here today, that expanded sensibilities of a linguistic nature and a cultural nature are not actually very difficult to bring about. We're not dealing with rocket science here. We are not dealing with nuclear physics. We're not dealing with topics which are far beyond the capacity of ordinary people. And I'll give you one example that I'm sure you'll all know. The evidence that was gathered by Bill LeBoff and his associates 20, 30 years ago with regards to Black English dialects in the States. That these dialects are just as valid as any other English variants, that they were just as rule-governed, that their patterns of pronunciation and emphasis were just as regular as any other dialect. And maybe the most important realization, that the Black English dialects serve the cognitive needs of their speakers just as well as any other form of speech. Of course, Black English, as I'm sure you know, made a particularly good test case in this regard, precisely because it was a dialect that had been so looked down on. So you could say that LeBoff's great contribution was essentially to say, look, if we can show that this most disregarded of dialects has in fact been treated unfairly, then by implication this must no doubt be true for other dialects. Well, all these demonstrations about Black English and the regularity and validity of other dialects, all this can be presented to and understood by anyone with an open mind. As I say, it's not rocket science. I know, because I've made presentations to teachers and teachers in training, as well as to hundreds of senior students in language seminars at the university. So in a way that makes it even worse, doesn't it? That so many are still left to labor under stereotypes and inaccurate and, of course, potentially harmful illusions. We know that many children who are socially or linguistically disadvantaged for one reason or another, we know that they very often have very real burdens to bear, very real material burdens. It's surely an unnecessary further tragedy that their linguistic and cognitive skills should be also misunderstood and denigrated. And the consequences in terms of impediments to learning, early curtailment of education, the dropout problem, for example, that I mentioned a minute ago, and following that, reduced chances of all sorts in the world beyond the schoolroom can be very, very significant. There have been some sympathetic voices in this area in recent years, and I want to mention a few of them now. There have been a number of recent works, for example, arguing for greater and more precise attention to the teaching of foreign languages, and they almost all stress the importance of the ideological framework within which this occurs. That is to say, unlike earlier and more linguistically focused treatments, these later ones encourage a broader sociolinguistic and socio-cultural contextualization. So that's good. What's not so good, of course, is the fact that their very presence indicates a continuing need. It indicates a continuing problem that needs to be addressed. If I can cite again the case of Spanish speakers in the United States, a colleague of mine named Flores presented a rather chilling chronological table a few years ago in which she showed that the assessments of the 1920s, a time when Spanish speakers were sometimes judged to be mentally retarded in the Anglophone mainstream, have now turned into condemnations of bilingual education programs that are intended to help Spanish speakers in places like California and Florida. So the misinformation is there. It's taken a different form. It's come out, if you like, in a different guise. But people are still laboring under terrible misconceptions. Another colleague, Miramontes, recently demonstrated a continuing tendency for alleged linguistic deficiencies, alleged now, not real, alleged linguistic deficiencies, to be taken as evidence of underlying cognitive weakness. That, of course, is a particularly unpleasant link in the chain. And, of course, this goes far beyond Spanish youngsters in America. Another research that I have cited here shows that since the French educational system is still largely envisaged from what the authors of this study called a monolingual point of view. They go on to say it's difficult for most teachers to view the different languages and cultural backgrounds of their pupils as anything other than problematic. So there you see it again. It's a problem to be dealt with. The authors further suggest, this is an interesting point, I think, that where linguistic diversity does seem to be mildly encouraged by the educational officials in France, this is mainly as a policy to counterbalance the hegemony of English. In other words, it doesn't stem from, well, we could say the purest of motives, but is rather meant to enlist people in another fight altogether. And there's something particularly unpleasant, I think, about using children in school systems as pawns in a game that they don't even know they're playing. Other American work that's relevant shows that's focused on multicultural training programs for teachers has shown that these either make little impact on teachers to be, or worse, they actually reinforce minority group stereotyping. I don't have the time, obviously, to go into the details of these studies, but if you accept what I've just said on faith, you'll realize that this is also a very worrying trend, if true, that those efforts meant to counterbalance some of this inaccurate or stereotypic information are not only not doing the job they were supposed to be doing, they may actually be making matters worse. In England, English researchers reminded us recently that the Swan report, which came out 20 years ago, which had made an argument for these sorts of improvements, greater sensitivity, not so immediate a tendency to see linguistic heterogeneity as a problem, that this report was essentially overtaken very quickly, 3 or 4 years later, by legislation in Britain, legislative reform that stressed the importance of what they called a national curriculum, which meant, in the eyes of many observers, less room for diversity. And later work still has only confirmed some of the difficulties here. One writer has written recently about the general shortcomings, the continuing shortcomings of teacher preparation programs in America. And in particular, she comments on the inadequate information provided about cultural and linguistic diversity. Some of this diversity, or some of the diversity she particularly focused on, had to do with Black, Hispanic, and Asian American pupils, and it was proved unpleasantly easy to demonstrate the views that Asian pupils were naturally expected to do best at school, followed by European Americans, whatever that's meant to mean, then Hispanic children, and then Black children. Teachers were also found in this same study to be more encouraging in their interactions with those children of whom they expected the most. So there you see another variety of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I call on a child because I think that child is likely to do well, and I don't call on other children, it's not very difficult to see that the children that I don't call on will gradually lose interest and are more likely to fall by the wayside. There's even evidence that even more specific training for teachers for bilingual education programs in America has been less than adequate. Saavedra, in a recent study, presented some representative comments from teachers in which they point out that the university courses that they take, that in many cases I should say they're required to take in order to maintain their teaching level credits or something, are often of very little relevance. One trainee teacher noted, this was in New Mexico, she says, "I wasn't prepared at all for the reality in the school." She went on to say, "Living here in the heart of New Mexico, we have very fertile grounds to develop strong, effective bilingual and multicultural programs, but the university doesn't have a good program to prepare us. There's no rigor. The content of the classes is minimal," and so on. Well, I could multiply examples further, but I think you can see the point here. If, even in some parts of, well, most of the examples I've given you are from North America, if in those parts of North America where you would expect the local conditions to be particularly conducive to sensitizing teachers to this diversity, if you find even in those areas that very little is being done, and what has been done is very often ineffective, then ask yourself what is likely going on in the rest of the country, and you already know the answer. When discussing the culture of foreign language classrooms, the best of some of these recent books and articles that I've been mentioning do at least begin to give some better and more accurate linguistic attention to the distinction between languages and dialects, and more particularly to the appropriate understanding of the validity of non-standard dialect varieties. But again, despite several decades of sociolinguistic insight, that is to say, of a literature which itself has become richer, more expansive, despite that, many of these more accurate depictions of linguistic variation, particularly at the dialect level, and I quote, have not filtered down to many educators and administrators or to the general public. The American Dialect Society, the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, and other bodies who explicitly concern themselves with these matters regularly issue reports which document more of the same. One writer commenting on, writing, I should say, about 20 years after Leboff's classic studies with Black English dialects, was very blunt, describing the American educational system as quite simply dysfunctional for large numbers of children who aren't part of the racial and language mainstream. She argues, as European writers have done, that multicultural education has often become trivialized by attention to superficial aspects of culture, no broad strategies for dealing with cultural and linguistic diversity at school. And even in areas in which there is greater sensitivity to non-standard usage, there is a very, very delicate issue which reinforces my concern that teachers be given more information here, and that is attempting to point out to children that the dialects that they bring with them to the classroom are valid linguistic systems, while at the same time pointing out to them by word and deed, as it were, that they may find it necessary, social life being what it is, to expand their linguistic repertoire. And I've had experience with this delicate question in different parts of the world, and I know how difficult it is for children to accept, on the one hand, that there's nothing wrong with the way they speak, and then be told, on the other, that they nonetheless have to expand and learn something else. And again, I need hardly point out that in order for that job to be done effectively, and it can be done effectively, of course, you have to have, at a minimum, sensitive teachers who are not prone to these sorts of stereotyped and inaccurate views. One of the problems is that unless, in my opinion, we do more at the level of training teachers to be, that training teachers after they enter the school system may be, not inevitably perhaps, but may be much more difficult. This is because of what one writer called, it's a bit of jargon, but referred to as the occupational socialization of schools, by which was meant the idea that teachers who come in ill-prepared in these matters are naturally enough going to be looking around to more experienced teachers or to other elements within the school system that they join for guidance. And if those existing teachers still exhibit some of these difficulties that I've been talking about, well, again, it's not very difficult to see that the new teachers, before they have a chance perhaps to think through these matters for themselves, are going to quite naturally become part of that prevailing ethos. Teachers, after all, like all of us, like everybody, very susceptible to the cognitive and emotional tone of their surroundings. So a corollary is that if we want to enhance teacher sensitivity, we want to replace stereotype with more accurate awareness of these linguistic and cultural matters, we could think of early provision of information as a sort of an inoculation against what may come later. Preparation that is early is better than attempted remediation later on. So providing you teachers with accurate linguistic information about the competencies of their pupils has in it the possibility of disrupting this chain of ignorance and misinformation that's otherwise likely to continue. I should perhaps put in parentheses here something important. I'm not for a moment accusing teachers of acting in any other way than what they imagine to be the best interests of their pupils. I hope that's perfectly clear. I'm simply pointing out that teachers, like the rest of us, are very often burdened with these inaccurate linguistic attitudes and stereotypes, and that teachers, by virtue of the unique role that they play in our society, are particularly important when it comes to the working out of these stereotypes and what the consequences of these stereotypes may be for the children who are in their care for a great many years. A friend of mine, the late David Corson, who worked at the University of Toronto, also called for improved teacher sensitivity and something I'll come back to in a second, the benefit, he said, of having more teachers from the various linguistic groups themselves represented as teachers in the classroom. He said that classroom-related work on non-standard varieties is still in its infancy, but in a way that's inaccurate, and that inaccuracy is part of what motivates my discussion here. There isn't, in fact, a shortage of relevant work in the area. There is ample demonstration in the linguistic and educational literature about dialect validity, about all the technicalities of language learning, about all the varieties of bilingual education. There's a huge burgeoning literature, as I'm sure you all know. It isn't the lack of information per se, it's rather the lack of appropriate synthesis and then of application, particularly, I keep coming back to this, of course, particularly in teacher training programs. That's the crux of the matter. Now, the other point that he raised, the idea that it may be useful to have for minority group children, for children who come into the school system from different ethnic groups or having non-standard dialects and so on, that it may be useful for those children to encounter in the classroom teachers from their own particular group. I think it's probably fair to say that there are fewer such teachers in America, Britain, Europe, and elsewhere than we might like to say, might like to see. And it may also be true that teachers who are from such groups will be, by that very fact alone, more likely to demonstrate multicultural and linguistic sensitivity in the classroom. Seems quite reasonable. However, it's important to note that minority group members who become teachers may, again, by that fact alone, often be atypical of the group from which they've come. And relatedly, the process of teacher training may sometimes tend to accelerate a sort of middle-class socialization, one which has those sort of negative elements to it, which I've been mentioning up to now. So it's by no means clear, it's not an open and shut case at all, that simply increasing the number of teachers from particular sociocultural groups will lead to some sort of commensurate increase in sensitivity in the classroom. And of course, I'm prescinding entirely from the practicality of how many you would need and how many groups should be represented. I mean, one would be opening a real Pandora's box. And there's another point here which seems to me never to be mentioned at all, when researchers call for educators and institutions to encourage more minority group students to take up the profession of teaching, they may be encouraging a sort of self-imposed restriction that doesn't apply to other people who come from, if I can call it for the moment, the mainstream, the majority speakers from the majority cultural setting. For example, I've had over the years in Nova Scotia a number of Canadian native students, Aboriginal Canadian students, in my university seminars, and many of them told me, when I asked them, as I always do, that they intended to become teachers. And as I began to know them a little bit better, it was apparent that in most cases, as the relatively educated minority within a socioeconomically depressed minority, they felt a duty, an admirable duty, to give something back to their community. Well, as I say, those motives are altruistic and highly commendable, but I came to realize that at least some of my students were charting their career course out of a sense of obligation rather than on the basis of personal preference. And it struck me that this was, in some sense, yet another burden that they carried, yet another limitation that their white Canadian counterparts rarely had to even think about. Probably didn't occur to them at all. I want to pass on now to some specific matters that, I mean, I've talked to you mostly about generalities here. I've tried to make the case that information exists, which I think ought to be given to teachers. I've outlined in a very sketchy form why I think this would be helpful to students, and why, above all, it would help us see that linguistic diversity in the classroom is not immediately ought not immediately to be seen as a problem, but rather as a fact, and then, as I said before, beyond that, something which could be actually considered a strength. I want to say something now about some of the specifics, and that's where I'll end the talk. Before I do that, I want to actually step back a little bit from language per se to look at a broader social context. Very often, the linguistic problems that are perceived, or the alleged linguistic problems that people find in the classroom, are allied with many other difficulties. I mean, people who speak non-standard dialects, for example, which have traditionally not been valued at school, are very often equally often children who come from socially impoverished backgrounds. They are, to use a term which has fallen out of favor a little bit, disadvantaged children. I think actually that disadvantage is a perfectly good term to apply to children, providing that we understand, and this is my reason for introducing the point here, providing that we understand clearly what disadvantage actually means. As I understand it, disadvantage is social difference that comes about through social stratification, different groups rubbing up against other groups, social discontinuity, inevitable comparisons between groups, and particularly, of course, between groups that are of unequal social and economic power. So that the knowledge, the attitudes, the inclinations that arise in one setting, and that may be in fact very reasonable adaptations to life in some particular circumstance, may be inappropriate in others. And now, just to bring that particular point home, the home lives and the home knowledge, attitudes, and inclinations of certain children may put them at a disadvantage in a classroom situation where other knowledge, attitudes, and inclinations are valued, not those that the children bring with them. Traditionally, as you know, many types of this sort of social or group disadvantage, we're not talking here, of course, about individual cases, were ascribed to very basic genetic deficiencies, that some groups were seen as simply coming into the world less well equipped than others. And if you look over the very long historical view, that has been by far and away the most common. If you're familiar with the psychological literature of the equation of nature versus nurture, or heredity versus environment, what I'm saying is that over this long historical view, heredity, the nature side of the equation, has been stressed. So by far the most popular view, but of course completely wrong, because it is shot completely through with prejudice and inaccurate knowledge of the causes and the consequences of class and cultural variations. But again, this is another example of an area in which, although there's a great deal of scholastic and intellectual information, not enough of it is filtered down, you know, to the classroom, to points where people from different groups within society actually come into contact. And indeed, I dare say we could go out and do a survey on the streets of Barcelona or anywhere else you care to think of and find that many people still have very strong views about other groups of people which essentially rest on hereditary premises. All these theories of mental and physical disability, of eugenic intervention in the bad old days, even immigration control, have all sprung from assumptions of genetically fixed inheritances. It's an interesting little aside, by the way, for those of you who are interested in psychology, that the genetic conceptions of the 19th and 20th centuries were essential foundation stones for the emerging disciplines of psychology and sociology, and for the whole testing ethos, which has remained so much a part of modern education and society. Think of the mass and terribly ill-informed testing procedures that were applied to immigrants flooding over the Atlantic to go to America, and the miscategorization and so on, based very much on this mistaken genetic information. And then extrapolate from that to the exponentially rapid growth of the psychological testing movement. I'm not saying it started only in America, of course. No, it started in Germany and elsewhere too in the 1880s, but nonetheless gave it a powerful shot in the arm. Well, social disadvantage leading to or correlated with linguistic disadvantage, if not genetics, if not nature, then perhaps nurture, perhaps environment. Here there have been two broad stances. On the one hand, there is what is called the deficit theory, deficit environmental theory, which held that certain social contexts produced real and long-standing deficiencies. And again, you can easily read in the literature and you'll find a list of these deficiencies as long as your arm. All sorts of cognitive deficiencies and certainly all sorts of linguistic deficiencies, which again, just like the genetic argument, meant that because of irremediably warped early experience, children's environments ill-fitted them for school. You may even remember that bad old phrase that used to be thrown around, cultural deprivation. These children were seen to be culturally deprived. It was a phrase used very frequently in the literature, even though a moment's thought reveals that it must imply that a group is being perceived as deprived of somebody else's culture, because it hardly makes sense to think of a community as being deprived of itself. And of course, that was precisely what the implication was. If I described a child as being culturally deprived, I meant that that child didn't have the benefits of my culture. That's really what it meant. It was an imposition of certain class values, attitudes, and prejudices, which produced disadvantage, created it, you might say, where it didn't exist in any material sense. So social difference then was translated through the power of social prejudice, ignorance, misinformation, was translated into social deficit. Well, obviously I don't believe that either, which leaves us as the default position, the view that says the reason for social, educational, and linguistic disadvantage at a group level has to do with class and cultural differences, not innate deficiencies. But we always have to have the important sort of practical proviso in our heads that society at large always, and it seems inevitably, sad to say, tends to translate differences into deficits. Again, this goes back to these points I made before about social groups of unequal power rubbing up against one another, one group having the power to impose its sense of correctness on another group, and so on. If mainstream sentiments hold that class and cultural differences are actual defects, then all the academic insights in the world become quite insignificant, because if there's one thing that psychology has taught us, it's that perception is everything. What do we have if not perception? And so perception has the ability to change difference into deficit. But even allowing for that, I would still say, that being so, it's still valuable to point out to people what's going on here. It's still valuable to know, even if there's an inevitability about this, it's still valuable, particularly, to come back to my major theme, for teachers, particularly valuable for teachers to have some sense of what's going on here. I have some other information here, which, in the interest of time, I won't relate to in any detail, but some of you will realize, perhaps, that just at the time when some commentators thought slightly more enlightened views of language and education were beginning to creep in, along came the work of Basil Bernstein with his notion of the sociolinguistic codes. Do you remember? The elaborated and restricted codes. Now, it's true that in his later years, Bernstein did a lot of frantic work trying to suggest that he didn't mean that one was bad and one was good. But I suggest to you that if you have a linguistic code and you choose to call that restricted, it's pretty clear what the implication is. And the damage that was done there by giving a renewed shot in the arm to these inaccurate, insensitive, deficit views of group and cultural difference is really hard to assess. To repeat, it's entirely possible, given the practicalities of the situation, to wholeheartedly reject these deficit perspectives while at the same time endorsing programs of linguistic repertoire expansion. As I said before, it's a very delicate undertaking, but we would be remiss in sending children ill-prepared into a world which is not as enlightened as we are. But to repeat, these sorts of programs, this sort of repertoire expansion, doesn't need to imply for a minute, nor should it, any intrinsic deficit in the maternal variety of the children. It's a simple acknowledgement that different settings call for different responses. No one would accuse, after all, a Spanish-speaking executive of having an inherently flawed mother tongue just because she learns English when she's sent to Chicago. No one should consider American Black English as a flawed dialect just because it's not the type of English that she's going to learn when she gets to Chicago. I want to say something too about language and identity. It's another one of my major interests, and really, if you think about it, it's at the heart of much of what I've been saying here. Because the subtext of at least some of my remarks have been that inaccurate or insensitive treatment of children's language and cultural varieties in the classroom amounts to an assault on a very important marker of their identity. And so I just want to remind you that all varieties of all languages have the potential to carry group identity, even those varieties which, even as they're being held, are stigmatized and looked down upon by other more powerful people in society. I know that the way I speak may create negative impressions in some people's minds, but nonetheless, it's the language that I grew up with, and it's the way of speaking that I learned from my parents, and it's the way of speaking, it's the dialect that I use when I'm at home, and it's mine. It's mine. And it carries just as much emotional, symbolic baggage as anybody else's. Furthermore, so there's no particular reason, based on what I've been telling you today, no scholarly, intellectual reason why I ought to change, why I should have to change. I might want to expand, that's another question, but why should I give up this? No. But there's, again, another practical reason, and that is it may be extremely difficult for me to change. I mean, it's a very perilous undertaking to attempt to move linguistically, or indeed other ways, I suppose, too, from one group to another. If you do attempt it, I suggest to you that you make sure you do it really well. You don't want to be left in the middle somewhere. If you're leaving one group linguistically and trying to move into another, you want to make sure that you make the transition very effectively. In Quebec, in the bad old days, before the Quiet Revolution, French Canadians who attempted to leave their French Canadian backgrounds, take on as many English characteristics and, of course, the English language as they could in order to move in what were then the power circles in Quebec, Anglophone power circles. They were often labeled by their colleagues as vendus, sellouts. Sellouts. Who wants to be a sellout? I mean, or if you are going to be a sellout, you want to be so good at it that nobody will know that you're selling out. So there's no intellectual reason to do it, and there are practical reasons that make it very difficult to do it. And there's a further reason, which perhaps I need hardly point out to you, and that is, if I want to improve my social standing because the way I speak is inaccurately, of course, but looked upon negatively by those around me, those in control, those in authority, my teachers, the bosses, and so on, I have to remember that it's not the only marker of me, of my group. Supposing, for example, my skin color also marks me as a particular group member, then it doesn't make very much sense for me to try and make a linguistic change. In fact, you may know that there's an interesting subset of the literature that shows that prejudice directed against people on the basis of skin color and racial categorization actually increases when they begin to sound more like mainstream people. It's as if they're seen to be somehow creeping closer in a way that is somehow underhanded. And there have been many, many interesting variations on the theme by which, you know, you ring up and you ask for a job, or you want to rent an apartment or something like that. And you sound just like, you know, the white person at the other end of the line. And then they say, sure, come round and have a look at the flat, or, yes. And then when you get there and they open the door, then everything changes. Anyway, there have been some interesting work done by a colleague of mine, Howard Giles, many years ago in Britain, in which he found that black kids who were living in Cardiff, who'd been born in Wales and sounded absolutely indistinguishable from their little Welsh white working class playmates, encountered just this heightened prejudice. So again, leaving is not only unnecessary from an intellectual point of view, it may be dangerous and perhaps even impossible. Just another point, too, about foreign languages in classrooms. I've been talking largely about non-standard dialects and the way in which teachers often, and others, of course, have very strict views about correct and incorrect dialects and so on. Just as it's often been thought right to work to eradicate, again, from the best of motives, to eradicate incorrect dialects and replace them with, in quotes, proper ones, so schools have often considered implicitly or sometimes explicitly that the sooner foreign language speaking pupils engage with language shift, the better. But there's a curious hypocrisy or paradox anyway here, because at the same time, schools have always understood that the expansion of linguistic repertoires is an important part of the educational process. Many tensions arise here. For example, the same school that values and teaches French or Spanish may do little or nothing to recognize or adapt or build upon the Hausa or the Arabic or the Turkish that comes through the door with new immigrant pupils. In the eyes of the linguist, all languages are equal, but socially speaking, some are more equal than others. Schools, again, I need hardly point out to you, are products and reflections of the larger society that surrounds them. So an implication is that it's going to be easier to teach German in Nijmegen than it is in Nebraska. Easier, and also more immediately recognized as a useful and rational thing to do. These matters return us again to questions of social reality and attitudes, and it's these, after all, not any inherent linguistic features, that dictate the teaching of French and the ignoring of Bulgarian. And it's this interaction of attitudes with motivations that can make classroom teaching and classroom learning contexts very different from those that obtain outside the school gate. One final little corollary on that point, and that is the interesting case in which the, in inverted commas, foreign language is actually the indigenous language of the area. For example, the situation with which I'm most familiar, having to do with Irish in Ireland, where Irish is essentially taught to most Irish people as a foreign language, but of course in another sense, in a social, psychological sense, it's not a foreign language. It's not like Arabic would be in Dublin, for example. And there's a special poignancy tied up with all sorts of historical and cultural things, which again requires great sensitivity, which I suppose is essentially the point of my talk to you today. Well, perhaps that's, I'm sure that's enough. Let me just summarize. Really, the talk, as I have seen it this evening, has been in two parts. In the first part, I essentially tried to make a general sort of argument for greater sensitivity to linguistic and, by extension, cultural variation in the classroom. And I tried to say that even if you were that rarest of teachers that didn't actually encounter at the moment much heterogeneity in the classroom, it would still behoove you, simply by the fact of being a teacher, to pay attention to something which is part and parcel of all good education. I don't see how you can really have education worthy of the name that doesn't have multicultural awareness. It would seem to me a very strange sort of education indeed. Related to that, I tried to point out that the essential features that one would like to see presented to teachers, particularly teachers in training, are not very difficult to take on board. Again, if you think back to the demonstrations that Leboeuf did with, demonstrating the validity of Black English, I mean, not very difficult to understand. Once you've been told them, once you've been shown the rule-governed, regulated aspects, once you've been disabused of the idea that this is simply some approximation, some substandard, not just non-standard, but some substandard variety, I think that can stay with you forever, and you can then extrapolate it to other dialects. So that was the first sort of general part. And then in the second part, I tried to point out a number of things, a number of sort of individual components, something about the very nature of linguistic disadvantage, about how ideas of, in inverted commas, bad or incorrect languages and dialects still persist, how, misinformation out there in the real world can change difference into deficiency, and how, while on the one hand that's a reality that we have to accept and deal with, it makes even more important the understanding of really what's going on there for teachers, particularly for teachers. I touched a little bit on the idea of language and identity. This is another reason for this sensitivity, because if you accept that all varieties of language are valid for the needs for the immediate needs, at least, of their speakers, and that all varieties have symbolic value as well as purely communicative value, then you see once again that there's a link between language and identity. And so interfering with language is more than interfering with an instrument. It's interfering with something, to go back to the very beginning of my talk, interfering with something which acts as a very important marker, not the only marker, but an important marker of my sense of belonging. I said a little bit about foreign languages at school, and I hope finally, I hope that therefore I've summarized a little bit both the main thesis and some of the, I would say, the more important specifics of what I think is a very important story. Thank you very much.
De forma molt moderada, entrem en aquesta última part en què obrim el debat a preguntes des del públic. El professor té auricular i, per tant, podeu fer servir qualsevol varietat d'anglès, però qualsevol també varietat de català. I, per tant, això costarà sempre a costa, perquè no ens hem posat d'acord abans a dir qui farà la primera pregunta. Mercè, moltes gràcies. Hi ha un micròfon aquí, sí. El que demanaríem, perquè s'ha allargat una mica, és d'intentar de ser sintètics amb els comentaris. Gràcies.
Thank you very much, John, for this interesting talk. You pointed out something important. You said that maybe it would be good to have teachers from these disadvantaged cultural groups in our classrooms. When you were talking about that, I was thinking about these classes where we have maybe people from, I don't know, 6, 7 different backgrounds and different languages and cultures. So maybe if we have somebody from another culture can help this specific group, but what do we do with the others? In my opinion, I think that you pointed out something very important. It's this cultural and language awareness, and that's essential. But it's very easy to do that for any teachers. Any teacher is a language teacher. A mathematics teacher is a language teacher too, because if he wouldn't speak a language, he wouldn't be able to teach mathematics, I suppose. So in any class, any teacher, in my opinion, should take account of the languages and cultures that appear in the class, and that's easy to be done. So just asking the children, how do you say that in your language? Look for information, give us some, teach us something about things like this. Nothing else, thank you.
Yes, I think, well, I know you're right because you agreed with me. Yes, of course, you know, it's a practical problem. I mean, many classes have all sorts of kids from different cultural and class backgrounds, and I mean, you can't have 8 teachers in every classroom, which is why I said not only is there no compelling scholarly evidence to say that just having teachers from a particular group is going to be better even for children from that group. So there is the practical problem that you raise, which is why the obvious fallback position is to train teachers, and again I agree with you, all teachers, better in terms of this sort of cultural and linguistic sensitivity that I've been talking about. We can't expect every teacher to be a polymath. That would be silly, and it's not necessary. There are other technical ways of dealing with those things. But what could be done, I repeat, is better training at the beginning, better component within the existing training that pays some attention to these sorts of problems that I've talked about. And I mean, okay, schools can't compensate for society. Schools tend, I know, more to reflect society than to lead it. And I mean, I'm aware of all those cliches, and they're true, but that's no reason for not trying to do something where we can. And I would say something useful to do is to give teachers some of these insights from applied linguistics, from psychology and sociology and so on. They can be packaged effectively. Teachers, any intelligent person can understand them, I think, as long as they have an open mind to begin with and are not prejudiced beforehand. So yes, I agree with you that, I mean, a broad-based sensitivity, that's what we're aiming for, linguistic and cultural awareness. Yes, thank you.
Bé, gràcies. Em dic Pere, soc investigador d'Humanitats i la llengua és materna, perquè nosaltres ens passem 9 mesos dins de la mare, mentre que el pare serà pagès, pastor, pescador o el que sigui. Per tant, primer, la llengua és de la mare naturalesa i la llengua i el so és matern. I la llengua materna és intuïció i perfecció perquè les llengües estan refugiades en famílies i no les pot robar ningú. És molt bo tenir aquests coneixements perquè estimulen i aporten idees positives. Sempre, senyor Edwards, existeixen camins nous per conèixer, ja que la nostra ment, el nostre pensament, també té que aprendre constantment, compartint idees favorables, simpàtiques i positives, pues som la suma de mares, pares, avis, els orígens dels temps, i la memòria està refugiada en famílies, que tampoc es pot perdre. Per tant, l'instint, la intuïció, la percepció, les paraules, sí que des de l'època dels faraons hi ha un excés de paraules o frases imposades. Per tant, aquest és el món. Per exemple, acabo ja, la Terra són 6 continents, no 5, perquè si no hi hagués l'aigua. I acabo indicant que una paraula fa la persona. Si dic blanc o negre és radicalment diferent. Blanc és gel, neu, aigua, vida. Negre és un llamp, un volcà, un terratrèmol. Per tant, hi ha d'haver-hi unes ganes d'intercanviar un so positiu favorable i amè. Vinga, endavant.
Thank you.
Professor John Edwards, just one question. The National Textbook Company published in the 90s a book called The Antithesis Dictionary of Spanish Cognates, with about 20,000 cognates classified in 100 semantic fields. From my point of view, cognates are very important to teach languages because somehow they relate languages in a way that we cannot do it differently, right? So my point, I've been trying to find out how many of these dictionaries, how many units of these dictionaries have been sold, or whether these dictionaries have had an impact, selling impact in the United States or Canada, but I haven't found out. I was wondering whether there was any kind of research or data saying the amount of these books that had been sold, or whether there was a research telling which could be the results. I know there is another dictionary, French-English, cognate dictionary, sold online, about 10,000 cognates between French and English, but I still don't know what is the impact of these books on the market. Do you have any idea about this?
No. I don't, but I think it's an extremely interesting, I'm just being a little glib, of course. I don't, because language learning at that level is not my métier. But I agree with you that, I mean, it's an obvious teaching, learning tool, and I think it would make a very interesting research question. Further than that, I would be surprised if there isn't research on that already. I can't, off the top of my head, tell you where first to look, but I don't think it would be too difficult to find out by application to some of the large Spanish teaching organizations, for example, in America, to find out, you know, the answer. Just as a little aside, though, I'm sure you'd agree that although cognates are very useful and so on, we have to be careful of what they call in French faux amis. You know, where you think you know something because the word looks similar, but it turns out to mean something not quite the same. But that's a minor, I mean, I agree with you, of course, and particularly cognates are very useful when the languages involved are themselves reasonably closely related. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't honestly know the answer to your question, but perhaps there's somebody here in the room who does, and if not, I don't think it'd be too difficult to find out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to raise a question. M'agradaria, can I put the question in Catalan?
Yes,
it's easier for me.
Sure, yeah.
M'agradaria...
No, I hate this.
No.
I think I need a different sort of ear.
Well, I'll try to do it in English if...
No, please, it's okay. I'll get it in a minute. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, m'agradaria posar en relació dos punts que ha tractat en la seva conferència. D'una banda, ha dit, i és veritat, que hi ha molta literatura, molta bibliografia sobre aquestes qüestions, que el que realment falta són síntesis i aplicacions. D'altra banda, crec que té també molta raó quan diu que dins de l'escola s'hi reflecteixen els estereotips, els prejudicis, les ideologies que hi ha en l'entorn de la societat. Ens agradaria conèixer, si vostè ens pot donar referència, de síntesis i aplicacions de què pot fer un ensenyant per gestionar els prejudicis lingüístics i prejudicis culturals, perquè entenem que aquesta és una de les eines que més falta fan els ensenyants que tenen una gran diversitat dins de la seva aula, però que al mateix temps veuen que els prejudicis de l'entorn pesen sobre aquesta diversitat.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Well, first of all, I would say, just to repeat something I mentioned before, we can't expect that any intervention is going to change everything. I mean, one always does what one can in admittedly a limited way. And I mean, I'm not so optimistic as to think that these prejudices, these inaccuracies anyway, maybe not always prejudices, but these inaccuracies that people have about, largely about other people's language, of course, are going to go away very quickly, even if we had a very effective program of training teachers. Because teachers, it's true, have pretty close charge of children for quite a long time, and at very impressionable ages, but ultimately the children go home in the evening, they're released into the larger society, of course. But you may remember I used the metaphor of an inoculation, a vaccination. So, you know, maybe you vaccinate the teachers, you inoculate the teachers, and they maybe give the children in turn just a little help, just, you know. As to the actual information and the provision of the information, that was really the heart of the talk. I think it wouldn't be difficult, I know it wouldn't be difficult, to build in some of the things that I just touched on here in passing, about which there is a big research literature, which unfortunately is usually written only for other researchers. But it wouldn't be at all impossible to put together components or modules that could be inserted into teacher training programs in a much greater way than is done. But then further than that, I don't see why we couldn't produce a series of small books or booklets that would highlight in very practical terms things which would be useful for teachers to know when encountering, in other words, the sort of book that would say, in effect, this is an important issue. There's lots of scholarly research and interests. People have written, libraries full of books about this. And here is a distillation which you may find useful. I mean, I don't think we want to be condescending to teachers. I mean, that's another problem to avoid. Teachers are very often fed up with experts coming from the outside telling them what they want to do. Now, so you've got to be careful. But I think it would be possible to imagine books that were instructive and useful without talking down to people, without denying for a moment that the teachers are the ones in the trenches and they're the ones, just to give them some assistance. And in fact, I would go further and say I think it's a tragedy, almost a crime, to have all this information sitting in a big category called scholarly research, and so little of it. I have seen, probably you've seen too, attempts now and again to translate some of this research into books or guides for teachers, and they're usually awful. I mean, they usually are either condescending or they just can't shake off that dead scholarly, So that's what I think should be done. First, initial should be just a part of every teacher's training to know about this sort of heterogeneity, and then back it up with some useful little reminders, as you might say. Yeah, thanks.
In fact, there are a lot of materials that have been produced by the Council of Europe on these subjects. So if you have a look at the Council of Europe website, you'll find plenty of materials related to that, ready for teacher training and for classrooms.
Yes, that's true. I mean, there are some of these materials, but they're not even, by which I mean to say they either don't, how to put it, they're often making a particular case under what seems to be a general heading. They're often making quite specific arguments, which may be quite valuable, but they don't have the breadth that I'm talking about here. I don't want things which tell you exactly, this is what you do when you have Romani kids in the classroom, and this is what you... No, we want a sort of a general sort of awareness. Yes?
Se m'acut des de la càtedra que en la informació posterior sobre aquesta conferència que penjarem a la pàgina web podíem afegir al final alguns enllaços a materials que vosaltres mateixos ens podríeu proposar, i sobretot aquesta possibilitat de materials del Consell Europa l'investigarem a veure si trobem una pàgina concreta, o si ens ajudes, Mercè, doncs donarem aquesta pàgina. Quan parlaves abans, recordava un informe sobre la policia britànica que havia estat acusada d'actuacions racistes, i el remei va ser que hi hagi entre la policia membres de les comunitats víctimes d'aquest racisme, i això ha baixat el racisme immediatament. I enllaçant amb el que també has dit, hauríem de parlar potser de la diversitat lingüística i cultural no només a l'aula, sinó a la sala de professors, al claustre, que ara en tenim fins a un cert punt. A la primària jo diria que pràcticament tots els mestres amb unes actituds favorables respecte de les dues llengües. Em temo que encara no podem dir el mateix de tots els professors de secundària, però no vull fer acusacions. Però, clar, en la mesura que poguéssim anar veient professors pujant pel sistema de la comunitat urdú o romaní, doncs això estic segur que tindrà un impacte social amb els companys, perquè no seran aquells allà fora o aquells a l'aula, sinó el nostre company, que segurament fa la feina igualment bé o potser en molts casos millor. Que això personalment pot ajudar molt a millorar els prejudicis i els estereotips.
The problem is when children arrive to school, if they don't belong to an English-speaking background, they don't understand English. And you have to do something before the children go to school. You have to take them in a nursery or in a kindergarten or for small children, and there they learn it. And if they can understand it, then it's much better. This is one question. Another question is also, if the children are already older and they started already school in their own country, and they are not, they must have a special classes where they're teaching still in their own language, and at the same time they got many classes to learn Spanish or Catalan or English, you know? But you have to do it at the same time. This is the way they do it in Germany. Another thing also, they have the 4 classes, also before children they go to school, they do something also to get used to school, but in a free way, in a play, like a play, not to be sitting down in another way, and then make it easier.
Yes, those are all.
And the social background is also important because their children, they may be intelligent. I know a child here in Barcelona. The parents also, they belong to the gypsies or to the Romanesque. They have no culture at all. And they got the little boy all the time sitting in a chair. And it looked like it was dead. And now it changed. Why? Because it went to a guarderia. And in the guarderia it changed. It's another boy. That is very important, the first thing what children do. When they're still early, you can change it and you can.
Yes, well, again, I mean, I agree with all those points. It would be, for example, it would be a lovely thing if for large numbers of immigrant and indigenous minority children in North America, let's say, if they had easy and guaranteed access to preschool programs, but they don't. They don't. But regardless of that, of course, my emphasis here is not on those sorts of technicalities, if I could put it that way, but rather on just the general ethos. I'm trying to attack a general feeling that sees linguistic diversity in the classroom as a problem, that sees something that needs to be fixed. And sometimes, of course, the perception is even worse than inaccuracy, as we know. I mean, sometimes it actually takes the form of prejudice, and that's why I started by saying, or why I said during the talk, something about, the different ways in which people sustain their inaccurate sense of how some dialects are worse than others, or indeed it's not too difficult to find some people who will claim that some languages are worse than others, and so on and so forth. And also, of course, important in the idea that when people make these incorrect judgments, they're not simply judging a language, they're judging the people who speak the language, and very often they're making a very easy slide from language to cognitive abilities. So really that's the thrust of my talk. I mean, it's entirely complementary to what you have said and what some of the other people have said. I mean, I'm just concerned to combat an ongoing bad situation, which, so far as I can see, we could do something about, and we're not doing sufficient about it, that's all.
Sembla que no hi ha més preguntes, no perquè no hi hagi més matèries sobre les quals parlar, sens dubte. Volem donar les gràcies al professor Edwards per les seves explicacions avui i per tota la seva feina que queda a disposició de tots nosaltres. Hi ha un llibre a punt d'aparèixer precisament sobre aquest tema que hem tractat avui, un llibre seu sobre la diversitat lingüística a les aules, i un altre també just a punt d'aparèixer sobre la relació entre llengua i identitat. Estem doncs, també convidats a seguir la producció del professor Edwards. I per part de la càtedra us agraeixo la vostra presència aquí avui i també us convido a fer-nos, com comentava en Miquel, a fer-nos arribar suggeriments, propostes, i veig també la Mercè Soler, que coordina el recull de bones pràctiques de la Casa de les Llengües Linguamón. Segur que hi ha moltes bones pràctiques que estaria bé que es donessin a conèixer àmpliament a tothom. Aquesta és una mica la nostra funció i podeu ajudar-nos a fer-la millor. Gràcies i fins una altra ocasió.